Good morning. I trust that most of you were here yesterday and had the privilege of hearing the story of Alvin's life, his autobiography, his biography, as it were, and just very briefly, if there's anybody here who, well, let me just ask: is there anybody here who wasn't here last night and who doesn't really know who this Alvin J. Miller is that we're talking about? Is there anybody here like that? I don't need to review. Okay. Alvin was the son of Joel and Sevilla Miller, an Amish boy who, when he got a little older, he left the Amish church, joined the Springs Mennonite church, and went on to get a bachelor's and then a master's degree, and taught at Kent State University for many years, and interrupted his career there at age 36 to go over to Europe at the end of World War I to help in reconstruction efforts over there. Okay? All right. Well, we begin our story here. I want to use a little bit of background to set the stage for this. And I'm used to having my laptop up here so I can push buttons, and I'm told that I can push these buttons and exciting things will happen. So, do I point it back that way? Do I anywhere? Oh, nice. Experimenting. Look at that. Wow, the wonders of technology. Okay. To set a little bit of a background here, Germany at the start of World War I in 1914 invaded through Belgium and into France. It took them about a month to work their way through Belgium against Belgian resistance, and during that time they the German soldiers committed many atrocities against Belgian soldiers and civilians. For some reason, it seems like the Germans thought that the Belgians were acting as terrorists and blowing up bridges and roads and things like that. And as far as I can tell, historians feel like the Germans scared themselves and reacted against a non-existent. Not that the Belgian threat was non-existent in terms of a military thing. The military was resisting them, but their actions that they took against civilians and surrendered soldiers in Belgium had to do with a fear that they had that did not really exist. And then they moved on through Belgium into France, and France was able to prevent them from capturing Paris and they built a line of trenches down through France, and for the next 4 years fought back and forth, sometimes going a little bit one way, sometimes going a little bit the other way, but never able to break much past that stalemate there in France. As you can imagine then, there were a lot of the war, the area that was over which they were fighting for those years, looked pretty much like a barren moonscape when they were done. Areas where the fighting didn't take place, there was not much damage done, but where the fighting took place, it was terrible. I don't know if you can see that picture too well or not. This is a picture of a town in Belgium called Ypres, and if I'm pronouncing that right, I hope so. But there's no pictures of it really before the war that I could find. This is a picture of it being reconstructed after the war. Houses in the foreground and a big cathedral there in the middle. And so this probably, they reconstructed that cathedral to look exactly the way it did, according to the original plans, before the war hit this town. That's what the town looked like after the battle was done there. I don't know, again, if you can see this one or not, but that's an aerial shot of that same place, and there's nothing there except flattened rubble. So that's what the battleground looked like. We're talking fields and forest and places where people lived, and that's what it looked like. Refugees escaping from the battlefield were moving through France to cities and places like that. In Belgium, Belgium was a largely urban country. They grew food for less than 25% of their populace, and the small amount of food that they did grow was being taken by German soldiers to feed their army. And so the Belgian people were facing starvation. However, Belgium couldn't import the food they needed because Britain had imposed a blockade on Belgium to prevent Germany from taking donated food that would come into Belgium. And then they'd take that food too, and then here you'd be, feeding Germany's army. So the U.S. was still a neutral country at that time, and permission was granted by both Germany and England for them to feed the Belgian people. Herbert Hoover at that time was a mining engineer, and I think he was in London or Paris. I don't remember. He was somewhere in Europe. He was a mining engineer, and he was used to the logistics of moving large quantities of material. And he was placed in charge of a committee for the relief of Belgium. And from 1914 through 1919, the Committee for the Relief of Belgium fed around 10 million Belgians and Frenchmen in northern France through voluntary donations. The flour that was sent in was shipped in cotton sacks, and cotton was highly prized by the German army. And so the committee collected all the empty flour sacks again and then donated them to Belgians who turned them into pillows and bags and garments and things like that. When World War I ended, there was a widespread food shortage and suffering from lack of shelter and proper clothing throughout Europe, not just in Belgium and northern France, but through many countries in Europe. This was occurring. And the U.S. Congress formed the American Relief Administration, or the ARA, the American Relief Administration, in 1919, and they gave it $1.5 billion. That's in 2019 dollars. And it received about that same amount again in private donations. And they placed Herbert Hoover in charge of this organization, and the ARA delivered over 4 million tons of relief supplies to 23 different European countries through 1922, and then continued relief work in Russia through 1923. All right, so that's kind of setting up the background here. One other piece of the puzzle is the American Friends Service Committee. When America declared war on Germany and its allies in April 1917, some Quakers, who were historically a non-resistant people, made plans to deal with the upcoming draft and the U.S. military. So they set up this committee, the American Friends Service Committee, to provide alternative service programs for conscientious objectors, both their own and from other peace churches. And if there were conscientious objectors who were sent to military training camps, draft boards, there was no uniform policy across the United States about how to handle conscientious objectors. Draft boards in individual states and sometimes individual localities made their own decisions about what to do about conscientious objectors. Some of them were sent to military camps in hopes that they would take up military training and fight. Some of them were given alternative service through the American Friends Service Committee and other things like that. And so for COs that were sent to military training camps, again, whether they were Quakers or whether they were others, they tried to locate them and provide support and counsel to them as needed. In addition to this, the AFSC collected food, clothing, money, and other supplies and shipped them overseas to help displaced people in France. They sent their own people over to join British Quakers in distributing these items, as well as rebuilding and repairing homes damaged in the fighting, helping farmers replant fields, harvesting fields, etc. Because, of course, many young men were absent from their normal agricultural position because they were off fighting in the war. So there was a labor shortage for farmers. And when World War I ended, the Quakers were one of the first groups to enter Germany, and they found the economic blockade of Germany by Great Britain had led to food shortages, which in turn caused badly malnourished children, many of which were suffering from rickets, which is usually caused by prolonged vitamin D deficiency or a lack of calcium. Milk would have been the answer to that, of course, but milk was in such short supply in those post-war years in Germany that it was treated as medicine. You could only get it available by doctor's prescription. So Hoover, remember Hoover was running the American Relief Administration for all of Europe, and he asked the AFSC if they would take over the feeding program for the children in need in Germany, and then the ARA would provide them with the supplies. They would just make sure that they got distributed appropriately. Over 1 million children per day and pregnant women and nursing mothers were fed by Quaker volunteers and their 40,000 German helpers. This lasted until October of 1924, and this program was called the Quaker Speisung or something like that. My German is not that great. And I meant to include a piece of German children's artwork illustrating this program in my slideshow, and it just slipped my mind. But at the bottom of that piece of artwork, somebody wrote underneath there that the phrase "Hast du gequakert" came into common use in Germany at that time, meaning, I guess, have you had your meal served by the Quakers to you today? Hast du gequakert. Anyway, and finally, the AFSC and the British Quakers were asked to help in the reconstruction of a 200 square mile area near the Verdun battlefield that had only 5% of the original houses left standing and almost no population. And as those people would return to this area, they'd need housing and shops for small businesses. The farms would need some livestock and seed and tools to begin production again, and perhaps help in the fields to prepare for the first spring planting. All right, all that is background to where we need to go today. What about the Amish and the Mennonites? Well, David I. Miller spoke yesterday about the donations made by the local people in response to the needs they read about in their papers, and similar responses came from other Amish and Mennonite settlements. The 1918 AFSC, now remember, every time I say AFSC, I'm talking about the Quaker organization, the American Quaker organization that is doing relief work in Europe. And in the 1918 AFSC annual report mentions branches of the Mennonite Church, which are supplying men and money. It specifically mentions that, quote, they have sent us, through their offices at Elkhart, Indiana, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, $46,000 in 4 months' time. $46,000 would be about the equivalent of $765,000 today. So in 4 months' time, that was the equivalent of what was raised. And I'm sure that it wasn't just Elkhart and Lancaster. They were a clearinghouse for donations from many communities. And because there was no other place for them to give, they gave their money to the AFSC to provide relief. Mary Mellinger wrote in an open letter, quote, to the dear sisters of the sewing classes of Lancaster County, dated July 13, 1918, published in the Gospel Herald. Again, quoting, I thought it might be of interest to many to know that our first shipment of clothing for the relief of war sufferers was made July 4. The packages contained 1,668 garments and were gratefully received by the Society of Friends, who will see that they get to their proper places. It may also be of interest to know that there are Mennonite sisters of 18 different states who have already sewed and sent in their contributions in the shape of ready-made garments to the Friends Meeting House in Philadelphia. Up to this time of writing, there have been 6,000 garments sent in by the Mennonite people. 280 boxes have been shipped and landed safely in France, and the Friends have received word that the garments have been very welcome and satisfactory. By October, that number was up to 12,642 garments, so quite a jump in a few years, or a few months. And when it says the Mennonites, to a Quaker, I doubt they know much difference between Amish and Mennonites and all that kind of stuff, so I doubt that this was only Mennonites. I think this was plain people of all description. But what about those who wish to donate time rather than money or goods? There was no Amish or Mennonite service organization overseas to which they could apply. So here and there, some people began applying to the AFSC. I'm not sure how many there were throughout or when they started, but by the end of the war, there were between 40 and 50 young men who had gone to France to serve with the AFSAC reconstruction projects, of whom one of those was Alvin Miller. Alvin applied on October 7, 1918. The application required a physical exam, 3 letters of recommendation, details about his education and training and experience. And it shows me that they were concerned about the type of people that they were selecting to send overseas to represent them and to help administer this relief. There's an acceptance stamp on the application on November 19, 1918, just over a week after the end of the war. And when they wrote an acceptance letter to him, they asked him if he still desired to go now that the armistice was signed. They assured him that the need of men with his qualifications was still great, greater than ever, they said. And evidently, he did still desire to go. And after his preparations were made and his training was completed, an A.J. Miller is listed as a recent arrival in France, June 5, 1919. He was sent to the Dole, France, D-O-L-E. That's a town in France, kind of centered north to south and towards the eastern side of France. But he was sent there where there was a factory that took lumber provided by the French government and produced furniture and prefabricated sections for houses which could be relatively easily transported elsewhere and assembled into houses. I don't know how big these sections were. There's not details given about that. The only detail I could find was that it would take about 70 of these sections to make a small house. So they'd build these sections and they'd ship them to where they wanted the house and assemble them there. Although there was some other relief work in the area, he likely worked in the factory. The The AFSC had built between 700 and 800 houses, some were of brick, and repaired 46 others, and built 35 stables and barns and 35 huts for themselves to live in by the time this factory was shut down. Truman T. Miller also worked at Dole, and he attempted to tell us what a day there was like. I quote, "The work at the shop varies. Several cars are probably at the station and must be loaded with houses for the Verdun sector. A carload of lumber came in during the night and must be hauled to the yards. The force in the machine shop, where the lumber is planed, grooved, beveled, and cut to proper lengths for the various sections of the houses, needs a lift. The new order for houses has not been completed, so the work in the section room, where each of the 70 sections of a house are made, must be rushed. Probably some poor refugee family living in the outskirts of town needs financial or other kinds of assistance. The whistle. What for? It can't be dinner time yet. The man is so busy that he forgets self and his physical needs. He heeds the physical demands, however, and makes his way to a small hut in the center of the lumber yard where the nourishing ingredients await him. During the noon meal, the problems of national and international importance are usually discussed in a round-table manner. After lunch, a quiet nook and a period of thought are very beneficial. Again, off to duty with an unflinching determination to make every moment count for God and humanity. He never wearies until the day draws to its close. To the man with an ordinary vision, such a routine would become monotonous, but to the man with a purpose in life, it is a very rare pleasure. In the evening, with a sack of wood on his back, because each one supplies himself with fuel, the physically tired individual starts for camp. He is summoned to dinner by a bugle call. At the close of the meal, extracts are read from the Holy Book, and another season is spent with the Master. He says another season. I skipped the first part where he mentions that early in the morning, before you go to work, there was a time spent in prayer, personal prayer time. And here he says another season is spent with the Master. The evenings are usually spent with good French families in behalf of the French language or in the quiet study with the sages of the age. So that would be the kind of thing that he was doing. He arrived there, remember, in June, and he would remain there working until August. But there were other types of jobs in France that were done besides just this. As I recall, the factory was shut down in September because I guess they'd made as many houses as they were going to make at that point, or maybe lumber was no longer available to them. It's not clear, but they shut down the factory, and those people who were working at the factory were assigned to other jobs. The majority of workers would have been assigned to repair or rebuild houses in the Verdun sector that had been damaged but had not been totally destroyed. Other things that you could do. You might be a canteen worker in Paris serving food to refugees. And you please understand that these things are not just jobs that would have been happening at the time Alvin was there, but throughout the time that Mennonite volunteers would have been there. All these things that I'm describing are things that Mennonite volunteers said that they did while they were over there. So canteen worker in Paris, serving food to refugees. You would give them a meal and a packed lunch and then send them on to the next refugee station until they got to whatever destination the government was taking them to. Or to maybe they had friends or relatives somewhere that they were traveling towards. Erecting hospital barracks or small houses at a hospital camp, and then helping to transfer wounded soldiers arriving at the railway station in long trains, loading them into ambulances and taking them back to the hospital camp. This sort of work was done in cooperation with the Red Cross, but always under the command of the AFSC. You might be distributing clothing to people who had lost almost everything as the fighting surged through their town or village. You might help to evacuate civilians when the French army thought a section of the country might come under attack. You might repair damaged roofs or damaged walls. There was lots of farm work, plowing, running thrashing machines to harvest wheat before it spoiled, mowing hay, repairing broken farm machinery, planting donated fruit trees, livestock distribution, which was usually sold at low cost to help farmers get a start on rebuilding. Chickens, rabbits, goats, pigs, sheep, and a few cows. Seed distribution. One worker said, on a trip to the Somme not long ago, that was not an area where they were working. They were working on an area near Verdun. Any idea that we had not been able to help our region was absolutely dispelled. On all of this trip of about 150 miles of the battlefront, we saw no place at all where a small village had been built. Even a larger village of about 300 or 400 inhabitants before the war would have 5 or 6 families back instead of 70 or 80 as in our villages. 2 cities of probably 20,000 or 30,000 inhabitants, which had been razed to the ground and which we passed through, had possibly 100 or 150 houses each. In one of these cases, the houses had been built by a big company, evidently to house its own workmen. There is no doubt but that in the districts where we have done building, we have advanced the return of the refugees en masse by at least 1 year. In these areas of our work, the people have been able to get a large proportion of the things that they most needed. This does not mean that they are well off. It merely indicates that in destroyed areas, the inhabitants have had the opportunity to get nearly all the tools and most of the small animals that the shattered state of their houses and their lack of covered space and their destroyed land will allow them to keep. In other words, it would seem that we have done all we can to give them the first start. The land is now less than 1/10 cultivated, and so the people can keep only 1/10 of the farm that they did before. I didn't put this in my notes, but I'm reminded that this was also an experience that one of them talked about. They had gone out to spend a day going on a hike, I think, and looking at some of the battlefield. This was after the war was over. 5 of them had done this. And while they were on their hike, they came across the remains of a dead soldier and dug a grave and buried him and held a funeral service for him. Now, Alvin, as I said, was working at this factory in Dole from June until August. And in August of 1919, the Mennonite Relief Commission for War Sufferers asked 3 of the men in France to investigate where else in Europe help was most urgently needed. They could see that the not too distant future, the work in France would be winding down. And were there other places in Europe that their help would be needed? And so where was the help most urgently needed, and was the door open for that help to be given? J.R. Allgaier, A.E. Hybert, and Alvin were the 3 men chosen. So they arrived in Paris sometime in September 1919. I should say, remember they had signed up, these 3 men and the others like them, had signed up to be working for the AFSC. Man, why is that so hard to say? The AFSC for a period of at least 1 year. But the Quakers were very, very generous in assisting the Mennonites in looking for another field of work. They released these 3 men to go traveling to explore what possibilities were needed. I can't say enough from what I read in my research about them, about their generosity and helpfulness to us. So these 3 men arrived in Paris sometime in September 1919 to get their travel documents and visas and letters of introduction, and they left Paris in October 9. They traveled to Berlin, Germany, Leipzig and Dresden, and then to Prague, Czechoslovakia, Vienna, Austria, and there Hebert stayed behind to assist in securing fresh milk to tide things over until the ARA feeding programs began. Budapest, Hungary, Bucharest, Romania, and then across the Black Sea by boat to Odessa, Russia. They spent several days in each place investigating needs and spent 6.5 days in Russia. J.R. Allgaier says, quote, "Upon arrival in any one of these cities, we first aimed to get in touch with any charitable organization at work, found out the nature of their organization, from where they were receiving supplies, what quantity they were receiving, where they were distributing it, the number of people that were being reached, their needs, etc. And in Russia, the only organization at work was the International Red Cross, whose efforts were practically all limited to the Army. After getting in touch with what officials and organizations we could, we attempted to find out conditions and needs as they existed in the most representative hospitals, welfare centers, almshouses, orphanages, homes, etc. In general, the whole of Europe east of France is suffering from a coal famine. Industries are not operating. Hospitals are forced to close their doors. Trains are unheated. Homes cannot enjoy the warmth of a fire. Coal has fairly become a myth of pre-war days. What this lack of coal will mean when these countries feel the clutch of winter, one dare not contemplate. Foods such as fats, oils, sugar, milk, and flour are most sorely needed in Central Europe. Clothing of all kinds is scarce, inadequate, and expensive in both Russia and Central Europe. Textile cloth and secondhand clothing would probably supply this need the best. Russia in particular is greatly in need of hospital supplies such as medicines, disinfectants, blankets, bandages, and linens. The so-called peace of Europe today takes form in suffering, misery, want, and disorganization. The need in Russia was seen to be desperate. There were many refugees due to a prolonged civil war between the communists and their enemies. In addition, a combination of the effects of war, a hard drought, and the previous action of Russian commissars confiscating all wheat, including seed for the next planting, in order to feed the cities, led to a terrible famine in many parts of Russia. Obi Gehrig reported in the Gospel Herald in the January 8 issue, "As soon as possible, relief will be given to Russia, though the door there seems at present to be tightly closed." An interview with Herbert Hoover and Dr. Nansen revealed the appalling fact that because of present conditions in Russia, especially as regards transport, it will be impossible to avoid the starving of perhaps 25 million people in northern Russia. Although the records aren't clear, it seems that the suffering that he saw in Russia was so acute that upon returning from this investigative trip, Alvin retired or gave his notice to the AFSC, was released from that, and joined the Red Cross organization, which was the only relief organization working in Russia. He did remain in Paris to work with the Mennonite Relief Commission towards beginning a work in Russia. But by June of 1920, he was in Sevastopol in South Russia and worked there for most of 1920. The famine was most severe in central and northern Russia, as I understand, and in southern Russia, it was not so much famine as other relief supplies that were needed. On September 1, 1920, 3 men sailed on the steamship Providence out of New York Harbor, bound for Constantinople. Let me see if I'm still awake. Okay, so the reason why Constantinople was chosen, and Constantinople is the old name for Istanbul. So I don't know if you can see Istanbul up there or not. Do I have a pointer? If I do, I can't see my pointer. Istanbul is right at you go southwest from the circle. Istanbul is right there between Bulgaria and Turkey, right in the middle there, Istanbul, and that's Constantinople. And that was seen as a good port and jumping off place for taking supplies into the Crimea, the circled area, which is southern Russia, and then on up into Russia proper. And I don't want to trample on the toes of the speakers who are coming after me, but I do need to say that the plan was to take supplies into Russia. Clothing, shoes, medicines, they were being shipped there. 12 tons gathered from 120 different communities and churches was shipped out on September 24. Along with the money donations sent with the men, that total was valued at $40,000. Now, that was in $1920, and that would be about $500,000 today. And the plan was to go into southern Russia to help Mennonite colonies suffering from the effects of war and famine. But conditions were uncertain, so they knew that they might just have to work with refugees in the Crimea, the circled area on the map, or in Constantinople. And Alvin was planning to leave southern Russia, where he was working with the Red Cross, and meet these men in Constantinople and give them advice based on the time that he had spent with the Red Cross in southern Russia. The men arrived in Constantinople, but Alvin didn't. He resigned from the Red Cross and went back to Paris because he was very ill. He was eventually able to recover and join the team in Constantinople. But he wasn't with them right at this time. Now the supplies arrived, and they sent them on towards Crimea. But just at the time that the supplies were starting to arrive there was a military defeat of the soldiers who were fighting against the communists. There was civil war in Russia, and the communists were fighting against their enemies, and the communists defeated their enemies in the Crimea and southern Russia. And so instead of being able to provide relief to people in southern Russia, all the ships had to turn around and go back to Constantinople. And in addition to the refugees that were already there, many soldiers that escaped the military disaster there, and many refugees left there as well, and came back to Constantinople. Ori Miller, if I recall correctly, was able to get off the ship just long enough to spend a day there meeting with Mennonites that he found and urging them actually to stay there, because he said the conditions are going to be worse probably back in Constantinople than they are right here. And he made arrangements and left some money with them for them to provide for themselves. Lowell, where are you, Lowell? Oh, Lowell, are you going to be talking about Clayton Kratz? Yes. Okay, all right. So I won't go further into that. Clayton Kratz had been working in that area with the Mennonite colonies, and they left some money there, anticipating that Clayton Kratz would be able to use that money to meet the needs of people in that area. He was not with Ori Miller in the Crimea here. All right, so then everybody turned around and went back to Constantinople. And there is where all the supplies that had been gotten were used, as well as many others. They were there for some years. Some of the things that they did to provide relief in that area, they built an orphanage. I'm sorry, they didn't build it. They rented a building for an orphanage. And it was supplied with beds, heating, kitchen stoves, kitchen and dining room ware, tables, chairs, furniture, laundry equipment, and other necessary supplies to care for 150 children. By December 15th, they had 56 children there. And they specifically said, these are the children that we don't think will survive the winter if we don't take them in. There were other children who were out on the streets and so on. They couldn't take care of everybody. There was room for 150, but they didn't have all the supplies they needed. So they took the first 56, and then eventually I believe they were able to fill that orphanage. But those were the ones that they thought had no hope of surviving. In addition, they opened a home for Mennonite refugees who had not stayed in the Crimean area and were hoping to be able to move on to America or to Holland or someplace like that. And so a home for them while they were waiting for their visas and so on. They could accommodate up to about 130 men. And I think they had some women's dormitories and so on as well. In addition to the orphanage, they did have food supplies that were available to them. And so they allowed underfed and malnourished children to come to the orphanage and feed them one meal a day, kind of like the feeding program was in other parts of Europe, carried on by the ARA and the Quakers. And they said there are many people who got sufficient food, many children who got sufficient food to keep them alive, that would not have otherwise, perhaps, or at least if they would have survived, they would have been very malnourished and ill. The United States Navy donated 5,000 pounds of flour, 8 bags of kidney beans, 8 bags of split peas, 8 bags of rice, 8 bags of brown sugar, 8 gallons of butter, and 500 pounds of ham. And they used those to feed the orphans and the other malnourished children that came there. See if there's anything else I want to add yet. So, through through December of 1920, there were only, now these numbers increased later, but through December of 1920, there were only 3 American workers in Constantinople. They said, we need supplies. A few people can take care of distributing a lot of supplies with local help. So there were only 3 American workers there. But they had been able to help in a Russian. There were several refugee camps that were built, and they were taking supplies into one refugee camp, food and clothing. They had the orphanage for Russian children that I already mentioned. And they had, my notes are messed up right here. There we are. They did work in 3 different refugee relief camps, and there was a total population, an average population of the 3 camps, about 2,000 people. And they distributed quite a bit of supplies and food in there. I think I had a few slides up here. Well, maybe I'll show them. I have a few slides up here about the conditions that were being faced in Russia and here, and why that need was considered so great. They are not pretty pictures, all right? If you don't want to look at them, that's perfectly fine, okay? But just to show you how bad things were. So this is a group of refugees, the kind that would have escaped and gotten to Constantinople or something like that. And these are the kind of people who would have been stuck back in Russia where the famine was so bad. I don't know if you can see that or not. But clothing, remember, in short supply. Food, almost non-existent for these people. And that is where we will be going next. Sorry. How do I blank this screen? You'll do it? Thank you. Thank you.